Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 95, Part 1, The Nelson Robbery. The Nelson Robbery was one of the major crimes of the Victorian gold rush. It involved the robbery at gunpoint of 8,183 ounces of gold, valued at about £30,000, by a party of thieves from the barque Nelson as she lay at anchor in Hobsons Bay off Melbourne in April 1852. The heist was as simple as it was audacious and ranks amongst the greatest robberies in Australian history. The Nelson was a barque built at Dumbarton, Scotland in 1844. She spent many years in the trade between London and Melbourne. The Nelson had sailed from London on the 4th of July 1851, around the same time that large quantities of alluvial gold were discovered near Mount Alexander. The barque dropped anchor in Hobsons Bay on the 11th of October 1851 under the command of Captain Walter Wright. He was totally unaware of the recent finds, and over the days after arrival most of the crew jumped ship. The Nelson disembarked its passengers and unloaded merchandise at Williamstown and then sailed across to nearby Geelong. There she took on cargo of 2,036 bales of wool, 99 casks of tallow and consignments of gold totalling 2,083 ounces, all bound for London. By January, the barque was once again anchored off Williamstown, ready to return to England, trying to find more crew. On Thursday night, the 1st of April, the Nelson was anchored at a short distance from the Williamstown lighthouse, along with dozens of other ships stranded for lack of men to take them back out to sea. Captain Wright left the Nelson for the night and placed the barque in charge of the first mate, Henry Draper, and his second mate, Carr Dudley, as well as the carpenter, 2 seamen, a cabin boy and a cook. Considering that some £24,000 worth of untraceable nuggets and gold dust was being stored on board, it is curious that not a single guard was assigned to watch over it. The same amount of gold today would be valued at around 28 million Australian dollars. Captain Wright had simply had it locked in the ship's lazarette for safekeeping. Henry Draper and Carr Dudley and 2 officers from nearby ships spent the evening playing cards and drinking. Sometime around 11 p.m, the card game wrapped up and one of the visiting officers returned to his ship. Draper and Dudley tottered off to their sleeping quarters, leaving William Davies, the Royal George's second mate, to sleep off the evening's entertainment on the cabin's lounge. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew had long since retired to their berths in the forecastle, so in the living quarters of the ship. In the early hours of Friday, the 2nd of April 1852, a party of robbers totalling around 22 boarded the ship from 2 stolen boats that were rowed from Sandridge, what is today's Port Melbourne. They pulled alongside and about 9 or so men, armed with pistols and swords, climbed up a ladder conveniently left suspended over the side and made their way on deck. Some went forward and quickly secured the 2 sailors and the boy in the forecastle, while the rest poured into the main cabin aft at the back of the boat. The first man they roused from slumber was Carr Dudley. He woke to find a pistol pointed at his head and a demand to go and get the first mate. Draper went on deck to find several men, all dressed in black with handkerchiefs masking the lower parts of their faces and hats pulled down to cover all but their eyes. All were brandishing pistols and swords. "We've come for the gold," the ringleader told Dudley, "and the gold we'll have." Dudley had gone on deck dressed in his nightshirt, but was allowed to return to his cabin to put on a pair of pants. While he was fumbling with his trousers, a robber, still pointing a pistol at him, warned, "We've not come here to be played with, so make haste." By now, the rest of the crew had been brought to the main cabin to join Davis, who, like everyone else, had been rudely awoken with a gun to his head. Draper was forced to unlock the lazarette where the stores were kept, and the men began loading the 23 timber boxes containing 60 kilograms of gold into their boats. Sometime during the proceedings, one of the robbers' pistols accidentally discharged and the bullet grazed Draper in the fleshy part of his thigh. The slightly wounded Draper and the rest of the Nelson's men were locked in the lazarette while the robbers collected all the ship's firearms and 2 swivel guns and threw them into the sea. They then left the boats they had come in and slipped off into the darkness. The cook had gone on deck just as the two suspicious boats were coming alongside the Nelson. Having no time to call a warning, he hid out of sight and remained hidden until the robbers had left. He then unlocked the lazarette, and Draper wasted no time going across to Williamstown to report the heist. The water police and harbour master boats scoured Hobsons Bay, but to no avail. The robbers had got away. Shortly after daylight, they found one of the whaleboats pulled up on the beach at Williamstown and the other across the bay at St Kilda. Leading into the bush from the beached boat were a set of wheel ruts left in the sand by a dray. Mounted police then followed the tracks until they petered out. It seemed the robbers had gotten away and divided the gold amongst themselves before dispersing. On the Sunday morning, 4th of April, a man stumbled upon the empty gold boxes discarded a short distance from a track leading to a St Kilda beach. He'd also found a broken rifle butt and a few other items left behind when the robbers broke open the boxes and made off with their contents. He also found gold dust and some nuggets glinting in the sand which had been spilled by the robbers in their haste. Several people reportedly scooped up the gold-laden sand and took it away before the police arrived to secure the area. And the Empire in Sydney reported on the 10th of April 1852. The Melbourne gold piracy. Intelligence has been received in town of a most flagrant and daring act of piracy. The men in the whaleboats quickly boarded the vessel and demanded the gold on board. He told the mate to call the boy who slept in the pantry, evidently with an intimate knowledge of the vessel and those on board. Some altercation ensued and one of the robbers shot the mate in the thigh. He was also wounded by another with a kind of spear, similar to that used by Customs House officers in examining merchandise. The leader of the gang appeared to be in a violent rage on account of the shot having been fired. The robbers ransacked the vessel, telling the crew that it was the Admiral they wanted, which had sailed a short time previous with a very large quantity of gold on board, but they must be satisfied with what they've got. The whole corps of the Mounted Police have just been dispatched to scour the country, with what success one must not predict. This will teach a sound though wholesome lesson to masters of vessels who have gold on board, and those custom it is publicly to boast of the quantity they have shipped. And the Moreton Bay Courier in Brisbane on the 19th of April 1852 reported daring piracy. We mentioned in our shipping news yesterday that the ship Nelson has been robbed of 8,000 ounces of gold. We have since ascertained the following particulars. From the readiness with which they went to the place where the gold was stowed, it is evident that some of the parties engaged in loading the vessels must have given some information, and we hear that one of the Lumpers boys at Geelong has been apprehended. A boat containing arms had also been found on the beach, so that the detection and conviction of some of the gang appears pretty certain. The gold is said to be insured in London insurance offices. And the following is from the Geelong Advertiser. There were some women or men disguised as women in the boat. When the pirates left the ship, they pulled into the direction of Brighton, but very probably altered their course afterwards. So the police were at a loss as to who might have been behind the heist. There was no shortage of hard men, recently attracted to Melbourne by the discovery of gold, and many felt that there were easier ways to get rich than grubbing in the ground. The Geelong Advertiser also quoted, those who presumed to know more than others about the affair claimed that only 9 of the 22 men who went out in the boats were in the heist. The rest had been handsomely paid to row them out to the Nelson and dispose of the boats afterwards. Oddly, a bag of gold dust was found on Latrobe Street, and it was thought to be part of some of the stolen haul. And also around the same time, a body was washed up at St Kilda Beach, and it was speculated that it could have been one of the robbers who had fallen out with his mates. Draper said one of the plunderers, weakened, broke down and cried with fright towards the end of the robbery. He entreated his comrades to stop. The plunderers hit him. It could be the man who broke down on the ship and was murdered by his fellows. Mr. Carter's body in the river. There were bullet wounds in his head and bruises on his body, testifying to a violent struggle. So the governor offered a £250 reward for information leading to a conviction, and that was matched pound for pound by the Nelson shipping agents. Over the next several days, 9 men were detained on suspicion that they'd taken part in the heist. Several were later identified as former convicts from Van Diemen's Land, and most had been found with large sums of cash and gold in their possession that they could not explain to the satisfaction of authorities. and it was reported that a total of 21 of the robbers were now caught. Police put out a dragnet and combed the waterfront. They caught many suspects, all with foolproof alibis. The quest seems impossible until the 7th of April, when a waterfront pimp betrayed one of the robbers. Draper was asked to identify the man. 20 sovereigns found on the prisoner and several disguises in his carpet bag indicated he was a shady character. Draper claimed the man was the gang leader. Uproar broke out in the police station. The prisoner denied any part in the robbery, but Draper was convinced. Davis of the Royal George was called in, and he too identified the man as the leader. Davis said his particular man entered his cabin with a number of other men, ripped up his clothes and tied him hand and foot. Draper also said, "I should know because this man pricked me in the side with his sword when I wouldn't move into the lazarette." The prisoner was John George James, a runaway convict from Van Diemen's Land and a former policeman of near Hobart. That was all police could find out, and he was lodged in the cells and held for trial. Police recovered some £2,263 in gold, cash, banknotes and other property from those arrested, most of which was eventually redistributed amongst the original owners. It is believed that much of the balance that the police had not recovered was fenced with a St Kilda publican called John Milton Dascombe, who was never charged with being involved in the affair. Only a fraction of the valuable metal was ever recovered. So over several weeks, several men were arrested and charged. 9 were eventually tried. A series of trials, mostly before Chief Justice Sir William A. Beckett in Melbourne and Justice Redmond Barry in Geelong, ultimately sentenced 5 of them to lengthy sentences to hard labour in chains on the roads of Victoria. John James, James Duncan, James Morgan, Stephen Fox and John Roberts. And John Roberts was later released after proving an alibi, but was soon convicted of another crime anyway. And none of them admitted to the crime, the only evidence against them that they had been recognised by the Nelsons' chief mate Henry Draper or the Royal George's second mate William Davies. They claimed that during the robbery the handkerchiefs had slipped down, revealing the men's faces in the lantern light, which they later identified. Rumours about who had been involved in the robbery abounded for years, and it was a baffling mystery. Most of them, as mentioned, were never caught. Those who faced court were only convicted on circumstantial evidence and dubious testimony of 2 eyewitnesses, and 90% of the gold was never recovered. Interestingly, several who were acquitted of the crime were later convicted of other crimes, including the St Kilda Road robberies. Writing in the Sydney Morning Herald 30 years later, Marcus Clark pondered some of the many rumours circulating around the heist. It was often said that a gentleman of standing in Melbourne society had masterminded the robbery and paid thugs to steal the gold for him. Another rumour was that several men about town had benefited financially from the heist. It was also suspected that a notorious publican had fenced the gold and quickly left the colony, a very wealthy man. Years after the robbery, the Nelson hits rocks and it sank near the Seven Stones at the entrance to the English Channel on the 7th of October 1870, while on a voyage from Aguilas to the Tyne, drowning the master and 2 of her crew. The ship's figurehead was recovered and on the 25th of February 2004 was sold at auction at Knightsbridge for £3,760. So getting back to those that were arrested. So it says that 4 of the 22 pirates were caught. They did end up confessing and told the story of the raid. The gold was sold, they alleged, at 30 shillings per ounce to a city buyer who had gone to England. The 4 were sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. 3 of them were captured in bed in a hotel in Williamstown known as the Ocean Child. On 29th of May 1852, the Sydney Morning Herald reported the Nelson piracy. On the 21st instant at the Supreme Criminal Court, Melbourne, John James, James Morgan, James Duncan and John Roberts were indicted for feloniously making an assault on the person of Henry Draper on the 2nd of April on board the ship Nelson, then lying at Hobsons Bay, and stealing from the said ship 8,000 ounces of gold, valued at £24,000, 24 boxes valued at £6, 9 muskets valued at £9, and 9 cutlasses, the value of £9, the property of Henry Draper. A second count termed the gold the property of Walter Wright. The trial occupied the whole of the 2 days. The following is the evidence in chief of Mr. Henry Draper, the first mate of the Nelson, which was corroborated in its most essential details by the second officer and other witnesses. Henry Draper. I recollect the 2nd of April. I was the chief officer of the ship Nelson, lying in Hobsons Bay. The ship was commanded by Walter Wright and has since sailed for London. The second mate, Carr Dudley, came to my cabin on the night of the 2nd of April and told me there were robbers on the ship. I went onto the quarterdeck where I was seized by some men who presented pistols at me. One of the men said, "We have come for the gold, and the gold we'll have, or blow your brains out." I asked to be allowed to go to my cabin and put my trousers on. One of the men went with me and stood over me with a loaded pistol while I dressed. I do not recollect how the man was dressed. I stayed in my cabin longer than the men liked, and 2 of them came into my cabin saying, "Come along, we have not come here to be played with." They forced me out of the cabin and made me stand against the capstan. I saw 8 or 10 men at this time. 2 of them guarded me with pistols. I asked them to give the second mate his clothes, and they then, one after the other, asked me to show where the lazarette was, threatening to blow a hole through me if I did not do so. I was led into the cabin and saw Mr. Davis, the second mate of the Royal George, lying on a sofa. 6 or 8 men were in the cabin at this time. They were all armed, one with a revolving pistol, another with a blunderbuss, and one had a sword. They again threatened me if I did not show the lazarette, so I pointed to it, and one of them took the hatch off. They desired me to go down, but I hesitated, and a man drew his sword and pricked me in the side. One of the men went down before me, and when I followed, he presented a pistol at me and asked me where the gold was. Some of the men in the cabin passed down a bayonet, with which he broke open the locker where the gold was and asked me to hand a box of it on deck. I refused to do so, and another man came down and helped to hand the gold up. At this time, one of the men who was standing in the cabin began to cry, and another of the robbers struck him on the arm, saying, "Hold your tongue, you bit fool. What are you blubbering about?" 23 boxes were taken away. They had been shipped at Geelong and stowed away by the captain. One of the men tried to persuade me to take a share of the gold, saying there was no fear of my being detected. There was no gold on board except what was in the locker the man broke open. The last box that was handed up was offered to me by one of the men who desired me to take it. I replied, "I have lived honestly till now and shall take none of it." The man said, "Well, if you won't, we will have it," and it was handed up with the rest. When I ascended to the cabin from the lazarette, the boxes were on the cabin table, and about 8 men brought the carpenter, the butcher, and the 2 seamen into the cabin and lashed their hands behind them with strips of torn-off tablecloth. When they had expended the tablecloth, they began to tear a shirt, but I asked them not to do so. The robbers began to take the ship's arms out of the arms chest, and my hands were also tied. I went on deck and saw some of the men preparing to lower the quarter boat. I asked them not to do so, saying that the boat could be no use to us with our hands tied, and if lowered would go adrift and be lost. I looked over the side and saw 2 strange boats. When the man who was guarding me got into a passion and forced me into the cabin, as I was coming into the cabin, I saw someone throw some muskets overboard, and seeing them prepare to enter the captain's cabin, I was fearful that they would injure the chronometer or do other damage. I wished to remonstrate with them and therefore asked who was their captain. When they said, "We have none, we're all captains." At this point, one of the men fired a pistol at me, and the ball inflicted a slight flesh wound in my thigh. At the report of the pistol, a number of men rushed into the cabin and asked who fired the shot. The man who did said it was an accident. Most of the men were disguised. I do not think there were more than 4 who were not so. I cannot positively recognise the man who pricked me with the sword, but to the best of my belief it was the prisoner James. I cannot swear positively to him. I recognise the prisoner Duncan as the man who handed up the gold from the lazarette. I am positive he is the man who offered me the box of gold. The prisoners Morgan and Roberts I recognise as 2 of the robbers, but cannot swear positively to Morgan. Also in the trial, it was stated that the gang had been concerned in several highway robberies on the Keilor Plains and in the Black Forest. The jury, after about 10 minutes, returned a verdict of guilty against all the prisoners. And in total, they were sentenced to 15 years hard labour, with the first 3 years to be served in irons. And another article, on Monday, 2 suspicious-looking characters demanded drafts on Sydney from the Geelong branch of the Union Bank in exchange for golden notes. These two were arrested summarily by the police. They gave the names of Barnes and Ball. Barnes had him a draft on Sydney for £300, £64 7 shillings and 6 pence in money, a nugget, 2 watches and a pocket pistol loaded to the muzzle. Ball had a draft of £500, £21 15 shillings and 3 pence in money, a nugget of gold, a gold watch and a loaded pistol. The prisoners stated that their 5 friends were to call for the chase cart and horse, and that the rendezvous was at the Ocean Child, a public house at Cowies Creek about 3 miles from the city. Chief Constable Carman and Sergeant Grant started for Cowies Creek and succeeded in arresting 4 men whom they brought in a cart to Geelong. When they arrived, they found a 7th man in custody. This man, when taken, had £10 and 10 shillings in money and was riding a grey mare with a new saddle and bridle. The 4 men taken at the Ocean Child gave their names as Hutchinson, Grimes, Morgan and Duncan. On Hutchinson was found a draft on Sydney for £300, £330, 3 shillings and 6 pence in money, a watch, a nugget and a loaded pistol. Grimes had only £20, 30 shillings and 4 pence in cash. Morgan only £32, 6 shillings and 4 pence. But Duncan had 2 drafts, one for £115 and another for £583 at £58 in money and a loaded pistol. So these men that were all well dressed, all 5 of them, couldn't explain who they were to the satisfaction of local authorities, but they were out of town before they could be arrested. And that's when police went and arrested the 4 of them at the Ocean Child hostelry that evening and brought them back to Geelong in the cart, and they had nearly £1,500 collectively in bank drafts and cash. So 5 of the 8 prisoners got off before they appeared in court, and then Duncan, Morgan and James managed to have the trial postponed until the 21st of May to allow witnesses to be brought from Geelong. So Barnes, Ball, Hutchinson, Jones and Grimes were not charged. So going through each of these men, the first one, John George James, also known as John Johnston, was a convict from Van Diemen's Land, and he was a former policeman. John James was born in London in 1819, and on his record sheet there were several entries of how he arrived, one stating he arrived by the ship Teresa with bonds on arrival. Another, though, said he arrived in 1843 per the Constant and was sentenced to 15 years transportation. And then a third under the alias of Charles Henry Johnson. He came to Van Diemen's Land per the Tortoise in 1843 and was convicted to 15 years transportation. Whatever the case, by 1852 he was living in Victoria. He was described in 1852 as 5 foot 10 1/4 inches tall, brown hair and grey eyes, a sailor and Roman Catholic. There were some singular circumstances in connection with the arrest of James, another of the 5 who were convicted. One night I was at the Old Queen's Theatre, and in one of the intervals went into the cafe or drinking saloon off the dress circle. There I saw the man who afterwards gave the name of James and called the attention of a police officer who was present to him, telling the officer I believed to him to be one of the men. The officer questioned the man, who appealed to the landlord of the saloon to testify that he could not have been one of the robbers. The landlord said James could not have been concerned in the affair, for on the night it occurred he was at that very saloon and was mixed up in a row and fight which occurred there. It turned out afterwards the fight occurred at 11 o'clock at night, but owing to what the landlord said, and because would not swear positively James was one of the men, though I believed he was, the police officer would not arrest him. Time went on, some days passed, and then one day I was on board my ship, being still on the Nelson, and I received word to come ashore and identify a man who was supposed to be one of the gang. It appeared that Mr. Davis, second mate of the Royal George, who you will remember was on board the Nelson on the night of a robbery, had seen the man on what is now known as the Gem Pier at Williamstown and had identified him as one of the men who was among the gang on the night of the robbery, though he would not give him in charge till I also came in and saw him. When I arrived at the pier, it was found the man had gone, but in making inquiries we found he had gone on board the Thomas and Henry brig, then at anchor, and was just ready to sail for Sydney. When we went on board, her deck was crowded with passengers. I looked around, among them as well as I could, but I could not see anyone I knew. While I was still scrutinising those on deck, a voice said suddenly, almost in my ear and in an undertone, "Go down into the cabin." I looked round instantly, but in the crowd around me I could not detect who it was who had spoken to me. But I followed the advice given, and on getting into the cabin, I saw, sitting on the table, the man I had picked out at the Queen's Theatre a few days previously. I was asked by the police whether I could swear to him, but I replied as I had before, that I would not swear positively, though I had every belief he was one of the gang. At first the police refused to take him. I urged them to arrest him on suspicion. He was dressed differently to when I saw him at the Queen's Theatre. At last the police did arrest him on suspicion. While the conversation was going on, the same voice I had heard on deck whispered in my ear, "Take his mate, he has got the gold." Again, I was unable to discover who it was who spoke, but looking around I saw a man in the cabin with a black leather bag. This man disappeared directly afterwards and forfeited his passage. It was found on inquiry that he was James's mate. James was taken ashore, and on being searched, a draft on Sydney for £1,000 was found on him. What became of that draft I never heard. The Colonial Times from Hobart on the 16th of April 1852. The late robbery on board the Nelson. The ringleader, a bolter from Van Diemen's Land, arrested. John George James, the man who was apprehended at Williamstown on Tuesday, was again brought before magistrates at that place for a further examination. James first denied that he was a runaway convict from Van Diemen's Land, but afterwards it was acknowledged by him, also that he was formerly in the police force at Hamilton near Hobart Town, and that his name there was William Johnson, which he further substantiated by documents found on him. He had little to say in defence and was remanded in Melbourne. On the 18th of December 1852, John James was housed on the prison hulk The President, and then on the hulk Success on the 2nd of April 1855, and he was still wearing irons up until the 30th of December 1856. He was in Pentridge Prison on the 6th of July 1857. On the 2nd of June 1858, he was granted a free pardon by His Excellency the Governor and released 2 days later. Said that James was a smart, first-class, swell mobsman. On the 14th of July 1894, the circumstances of the notorious Nelson gold robbery were revived by a petition presented to the Victorian Legislative Assembly by Mr Armitage for Henry James, who was convicted of complicity in the robbery, and he was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. He served 6 years and 2 months, 5 years of which were in irons on board the prison hulk, and then he received a free pardon as it was made clear that he'd been wrongly convicted. It was a case of mistaken identity, and the real robbers afterwards were convicted. The circumstances of Mr James's arrest, trial and imprisonment are set forth in the petition, and he asked the Assembly to take his case into consideration. Monetary consideration, no doubt, is what Mr James requires, but the petition does not say so. The second man, James Morgan. Well, James Morgan's criminal record shows that he was recognised as an absconder from Van Diemen's Land. His real name was James Gavagan, who was born in Birmingham, England in 1824. He'd been transported to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years at the Central Criminal Court for stealing 21 umbrellas, aged only 11. He left on the 5th of November 1835 and arrived on the Asia on the 21st of February 1836 when he was still only 13. He stated he was a brickmaker at the time of his conviction, and on arriving in Van Diemen's Land he was sent to Point Pier, the boys' prison. James Morgan's record runs for 2 pages. His offences continued until 1840 when he was transferred to Port Arthur. Gavagan's offences, once he started at Point Pier, came thick and fast, including making use of blasphemous language, which he got 2 days solitary confinement on bread and water, striking a fellow boy, same punishment, having thread improperly in his possession, which he stated he was using to fish with. He got 3 days solitary confinement for that. Absent from the establishment, he got 5 stripes on the breech. Insolent remark to an overseer and irregular conduct in barracks during the night. He got 48 hours solitary confinement on bread and water for that. Being in the government garden and having sprigs improperly in his possession, 48 hours solitary confinement, bread and water. And on the 22nd of May 1837, within 3 months of his arrival, he received 12 lashes after having absented himself for several hours. By October 1841, Gavagan experienced 6 weeks hard labour in chains for misconduct. When he turned 17, he was sent to the main prison at Port Arthur on a carrying gang. For the convicts, this was the hardest form of physical punishment. They had to go out into the forest, fell huge trees, trim and cut them into logs, and then drag or carry them to the nearest saw pits. He was often in trouble with the authorities while on the Tasman Peninsula. For his mostly petty crimes, he was charged a further 57 times, but finally was released in March 1842, having served his sentence. The records indicate that he was only in trouble with the law once after his release. He did a further 2 months of hard labour at the House of Corrections in Launceston. He's recorded as arriving in Melbourne on the Lady Raffles in 1842 and having a bond on his arrival. He was tried in Melbourne on the 22nd of September 1845 and he was sentenced to 15 years back in Van Diemen's Land, and this was for house robbery with Joseph Rice and George Farrell. So he was sent back to Van Diemen's Land per the Flying Fish, but absconded and made his way back to Victoria. In Morgan's time spent in jail for his part in the robbery, he seemed determined to cause as much trouble as possible. And during the time he spent on the prison hulks and in Melbourne Jail and Pentridge Jail, he was consistently brought before the authorities on one offence or the other. Some of his offences include insolence, obscenity and threatening language to the chief warder, exciting a disturbance, fighting, being disorderly, talking, and abusive and improper language. Sentences for these crimes ranged from 3 days solitary confinement or up to 6 months hard labour in irons. So on the 24th of April 1852, under the heading of the Nelson Robbery, it says, the following is the report of the examination of the suspected parties at the police office in Geelong on Thursday, referring to in the letter of our correspondent, piracy. James Morgan, one of the men apprehended a few days ago on suspicion of robbing the barque Nelson of a large quantity of gold, was placed before the sitting magistrates for examination. Mr. W. Henry Davies, officer belonging to the Royal George, deposed that the prisoner now placed in the dock was the man who aroused him from his sleep when on board the Nelson about 1 o'clock in the morning of Friday last. The prisoner took hold of his shoulder and endeavoured to wake him up, but the witness said that he was not inclined to rise so early. The prisoner then placed a pistol to his head and demanded to know where the gold was. The witness said he knew nothing at all about the gold. The prisoner was then joined by another man who also presented a pistol and told him if he made the least resistance, they would blow his brains out. They then tied his hands behind him with a handkerchief. Morgan said if the witness would join them in the spoil, they would give him a box of gold and it was all safe. He had not the slightest doubt whatsoever as to the identity of the prisoner. The prisoner Morgan had nothing to say and was then removed. And on the 27th of November 1860, Morgan was granted a ticket of leave for the District of Melbourne. In part 2, I'll be covering the information related to the other two that were arrested as part of the robbery, and also their history prior, and also what they got up to after they were released from jail for this crime.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes